Okay, so for this video, we're going to continue to look at different parts of more of the peripheral nervous system and really kind of get into this idea of proprioceptors, this idea that there are mechanisms to sense what's going on in the periphery that then sends messages to the central nervous system. And this can be in the form of various different types of sensory receptors. These could be mechanoreceptors, which we're going to talk about quite a bit here in the next few slides. This could be thermoreceptors, which are going to assess differences in temperature, which obviously become very key when it comes to cognitively how we function. This could initiate things like shivering, which would be an involuntary muscle contraction to deal with changes in temperature. Nociceptors, pain. We've experienced this, my guess. If we have pain, particularly in our foot or our leg, we may begin to limp or respond involuntarily as far as skeletal muscle contraction to that. Photoreceptors, we have receptors in our eye that sense that, and then there are motor responses to that. We may move our eye, we may change shape of our lens, close our eyelid, things like that. Then we also have chemoreceptors. These become incredibly important because they're going to sense changes in things like temperature and chemical stimuli, which will be very, very important in regards to pH, CO2, things like that. And so proprioceptors are the one place we're going to focus a lot on. So I want to get in depth a little more in these because proprioceptors, largely located in and around muscle, allow us to have an understanding of where our arms, where legs are. We often call it a kinesthetic sense. That's a term we often use, of knowing where our body is, what contraction is going on, what velocity, speed things are going at. And you may not necessarily have realized this, but we experience this in situations when we're walking on an uneven surface or like a surface that has gravel to it or things like that, where we respond to each step based on the stimuli of that step when we alter our gait. That's not something we necessarily think about. We just do, especially if we're in bare feet. Well, that means to receive that sensory input very quickly and then respond and alter our gait, alter our pattern, alter how much force we put on each foot, what part of the foot. Proprioceptors play a large role in being able to sense that. Also in muscle, we have these chemoreceptors, and we've already talked about in depth how we form ATP, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. We've talked about issues with that regarding producing lactate, an overflow of hydrogen ions. So we've gotten very in depth into that. Well, there are receptors, chemoreceptors, that sense changes in the amount of those hydrogen ions and the amount of CO2 being produced in different ions, sodium, potassium, chloride, things like that, which then sends afferent information to the brain and central nervous system. And this will become very important, for example, when we are increasing muscle contraction, that's sending afferent messages to the brain to say, hey, we are contracting, we should probably breathe more, which then causes involuntary response in breathing pattern, diaphragmatic contraction. We don't necessarily think about that, although you could. That's just a response to what's going on chemically at the muscle cell. So there are these receptors peripherally. With this, we have reflexes. And when you think of reflex, my guess is the thought, at least my thought, automatically goes to a doctor's office. And so when you're younger, or probably even now, a doctor pulls out the little hammer, has you sit on the table, they take it, they whack your knee, actually your patellar tendon, and then hopefully you have a response. You kick your leg to some extent. And that's a very common reflex, not the only reflex, but one where we have an external stimuli that is then causing some physical response, some motor contraction. So we have an external stimuli causing an afferent signal to the central nervous system, which then causes an efferent motor response, then causing muscle contraction. And so our next slide here kind of gives a good example of that. This is called the cross-extensor reflex. By the way, this picture is straight from your book, where we have some sensory input here. So in this case, in this example is touching a pin. We sense that, whether it's nociceptors, whether it's Corpuscles sensing changes in pressure. Irregardless, that's going to send impulses up a sensory neuron, an afferent response. And what's neat about this is that this is going to go to the spinal cord. It doesn't go to the brain. Which, if you think about it, makes sense. I mean, the amount of time it would take to travel to the brain, go through gray matter in the brain, which are slower neurons, for you then to respond, have that message travel down the spinal cord, down a motor neuron, would take far, far too long. And so these reflexes actually only make it to the spinal cord, which allows these to be incredibly quick and involuntary. And so in this case, we have this sensory neuron traveling to our spinal cord, traveling through here into a little deeper part of the spinal cord. There's some interneurons that play a role here. That is then going to cause a motor response, motor contraction. And here in this case, the picture uses the bicep, but obviously this could be any situation, causing contraction and then moving that, in this case, the hand out of the way. There is also a reciprocal inhibition that can occur, where due to this response, we may have movement of another arm, we may have inhibition of contraction. So in the case with this arm, we would want the bicep to contract, but the last thing we want would be the tricep, which is an antagonist muscle, to contract. And so we have an inhibitory response there as well. And so this reflex, there are many that allow quick movement to immediate sensory responses. And we rely on these. We rely on these when it comes to, obviously, a situation like this where we stand on a pin. In more athletic situations, we respond on reflex. In fact, we often hope for certain actions to almost become reflexes. Think of basketball, think of free throws, think of shooting motion, think of technique. Our hope is that those become so ingrained that they literally become a reflex. We don't have to cognitively think about, with a free throw, every motion, every movement of the elbow and hand and extension, that just becomes something that doesn't require much cognition whatsoever. And so because of that, there are a couple different types of these proprioceptors we're going to talk about. And one are called muscle spindles. And muscle spindles, we don't have them here, but a muscle spindle would be located inside, kind of along these muscle fibers. And they're going to be very sensitive to contraction, very sensitive to tension in the muscle. And those will send impulses to afferent impulsive signals to the spinal cord, which then sends efferent signals for contraction. So these would be very important if you're going to violently contract a muscle. That will then send messages to the central nervous system. We also have Golgi tendons, which are located more in the tendon area of a muscle, which also send these afferent signals to the brain, signaling then an efferent, whether it's a motor contraction, it might be an inhibitory as well. And so we have different types of these when it comes to what's going on in the periphery and then causing reflex motor unit contraction in the periphery as well. So the last thing I want to look at is just sort of this idea, and now we're gonna go big picture a little bit more. We focused very specifically the last few minutes on what's going on inside a muscle cell, what's going on with neurons there, what's going on with reflexes, very, very specific area. Now we're going to go a little bit more big picture, because this idea that our nervous system is kind of separated into parts, central, peripheral. And then when we move into peripheral, this idea that there's autonomic, and inside your autonomic, there's sympathetic and parasympathetic is really key, because there are a lot of responses in the nervous system that we largely don't control. Heart rate, alterations in blood pressure, vessel architecture, breathing, movement and digestion is largely not under our control. Now I know you could say, well, if I breathe, if I relax, my heart rate drops. True, but your heart rate is still going on, and so that continual sending signals from the central nervous system, that's autonomic. Those are involuntary. And so a lot of what we talk about in this class, cardiovascular function, how vessels alter blood pressure. We're going to talk at length about stroke volume and cardiac output, are all autonomically controlled. They're involuntary reactions. Now, there are things that can cause those to fluctuate that are in the periphery. Muscle contraction is going to cause changes, through afferent signals, changes in stroke volume and heart rate. But they're not under voluntary control. And so we often say that the autonomic nervous system is separated into sympathetic and parasympathetic sides. In other words, sides which sort of have a dual control of these involuntary reactions. And both are incredibly important. We have our sympathetic side. When we talk about sympathetic nervous system, we often think of this as the fight or flight side, where these are going to be autonomic responses which are going to initiate action. This would be an increase in heart rate. This would be an increase in breathing patterns, airway diameter, increase potentially in cognition. From a cellular level, this would instigate increases in not just ATP usage, but ATP formation, rates of glycolysis, things like that. Sympathetic responses, and there's a place for those, causing the release of cortisol, other key endocrine hormones, very important. However, you can't live in the world of sympathetic nervous system. We can't have that continuing to go for 24 hours a day. There needs to be another side to that. In this case, the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, when we think of this, probably the best example of this is at rest. When we're sleeping, during sleep, we actually are seeing the release of a lot of key hormones, growth hormone being one, which is initiating things like protein synthesis, which is initiating regeneration of other tissue, things like that. This is where we're seeing an increase in digestion, movement, particularly in the small intestine and the large intestine. These are all what we call parasympathetic responses, and incredibly key to keeping homeostasis, to keeping other tissues, muscle tissue, which has to contract, healthy, and being able to do that. And so we need to have a balance of both of these. We can't have too much sympathetic, and likewise, we can't have too much on the other side as well. And this is just sort of a picture of what's involved here. And one thing you'll notice here is that it's not uncommon for organs to be involved in both sides. For example, the heart. You can have the heart being involved in a sympathetic response, obviously increasing heart rate. However, there is parasympathetic control of the heart as well. When we see things like the liver, there is sympathetic and there's parasympathetic control there. And so that's just one thing to grasp here, is that literally almost every organ in the body, arguably every system in the body, is being affected by the nervous system, whether it's sympathetic, parasympathetic, or in some cases, it'll be both. And this is sort of just a list of things. Don't memorize this. I'm not keen on you doing that. But just to grasp that, in literally every chapter of this book, which we'll talk about, there is sympathetic and parasympathetic control, or both, of those systems. So that's a good place to pause. We're going to continue muscle contraction. We're going to talk about muscle fibers and muscle typing and those things in class. And so this is a good primer for that as we talk about muscle contraction, understanding how neurons work, how the nervous system works, and how the nervous system plays obviously a key role in that contraction.